Right, so the question that we're going to kick off with is protest relevant in the 21st century? In particular, what Bob was saying this morning, and also what Aidan has shared with us now. Who'd like to kick off and share their thoughts? Alex.
Well, is protest relevant in the 21st century? Well, I suppose unions have got a long history. So I'm Alex, I'm the Secretary of UnionsACT. We represent 33,000 union members in Canberra, and obviously part of a broader movement around the country, which has 2 million members, with the largest social movement in Australia. And for all of our history, for over 150 years, protest has been an integral part of what we've done. A lot of the protest that we do is hidden, so it's in the workplace, and it takes various guises, takes forms of industrial action, which is a type of protest, but no one would ever see that unless you worked in the workplace. But we also do big, spectacular protests, and we have national days of action. The big examples of that would have been during the Your Right to Work, where we had the Fill the G, where we filled the MCG. We had some of the largest protests in recent history, where we had over 100,000 people on the streets. Just recently, the most recent protest that I've been to was the National Day of Action opposing the Abbott government. There were 500 people in Canberra, which doesn't sound like a lot, but there were over 100,000 people nationwide, 50,000 people in Melbourne that protested, that came out, took to the streets. And so I suppose, from a union point of view, protest is still very much relevant to what we do. It's one of the tools that we use to get the outcomes that we want. So it's not necessarily the first thing that we do when we have an issue, but it's definitely in the toolkit, it's in the arsenal, and there's a lot of debate that we go through before we do some kind of protest, whether it's an industrial action, whether it's a community protest, or whether it's we also have picket lines, which is another type of protest that you would see, and obviously the big marches and the demonstrations that we have.
So Miranda, would you like to share your thoughts on protest in the 21st century?
Sure. Can people hear me, or should I have the mic?
Yep, they're nodding yes,
Okay.
so you're okay.
Great. Yeah, I think absolutely it's relevant in the 21st century, and I think most people here would be aware that, you know, we do live in a time of, we have ecological crisis, we have these huge issues that we're facing, and people are getting active and getting aware and wanting to do something about it. And I think it's also really important now as it ever was, because I think we face powerful institutions that aren't just going to roll over and give up their power. So we're in a situation where we have issues that aren't going to be resolved by the community just asking nicely. We're faced with governments, we're faced with corporations and other institutions that it's in their interest to hold on to their power, to hold on to the status quo. And I think that's why we have to sort of get out there and actually challenge them in a really direct way. Part of what I've been involved in over the last decade has been a lot of protests in the forest. And one big example is in the Upper Florentine Valley, we had a protest that went for 7.5 years. So we had a forest blockade where people were directly in the way of logging machinery every day for 7.5 years to make sure they didn't log that area. Now, if we didn't go in there and do this sort of protest, if we didn't actually put our bodies on the line, then, you know, if we sort of just asked nicely, please, would someone protect the forest, or, you know, hope that the government's going to sort it out, or that the corporations will suddenly realise they don't want to destroy the forest anymore, then we would have lost that forest. As it turns out, 2,000 hectares of that whole valley, 2,000 hectare valley, is World Heritage now. And yeah, it totally would be full of clear fells, full of roads. They wanted to put 15 clear fells and 10.5 kilometres of road into that valley. We were, meanwhile, we were campaigning around World Heritage. So there's sort of like the frontline protest, but that's also just one part of what kind of makes up a protest movement, and we were campaigning on lots of different levels. But if we didn't have that frontline protest, then that campaign, it would have been too late by the time we won World Heritage. It would be full of clear fells and potentially not able to get World Heritage listed because it had been degraded. So yeah, I think that it's definitely relevant, not just in the forest, but for so many issues where we actually need to be out on the front lines and making that direct challenge.
So Josh, has the nature of protest in this century changed, and if so, how and why?
Maybe to try and answer both questions, I think they're very closely related. I think whether we need protests in the 21st century, yes we do, but what we need most importantly is what Aidan was talking about, and that is organised communities, social movements. Bentley was a protest. The reason Bentley was a protest that forced the New South Wales government to cancel McGasco's coal seam gas licence was because that community had been so deeply organised, people were so aware, they felt a sense of agency and power by gathering together and forming this protest and taking on this issue. And I think that is our challenge in this century. It's our challenge in the next 5 to 10 years with the kind of issues that we're talking about, the kind of power holders that we're facing against. Miranda named before. It's not just political targets that we need to be worrying ourselves with. It's not just trying to influence our elected representatives, but it's looking at what influences there are on those elected people. So corporate power, my particular interest with the fossil fuel industry, have incredible influence over our political elected leaders. So we need to pull apart, who we should be targeting. We need to be working out what kind of power and influence we need to have over those targets, and we need to be doing the work in our communities to be ready to take on those fights.
So leading on to that, Anna, because you've also, in other hats that you've worn, especially in Simon's campaign, has the nature of protest changed, or the coordination of bodies and groups to actually get that community build that Josh was talking about?
Yeah, I think, I guess I've been involved in social movements and protesting since I was 14, and I'm almost 32 now, so that's, I guess, over half my life. And the core principles around community organising and campaigning, I think, are still the same, but the nature of how we can execute protest actions and amplify the message has certainly changed. I remember the first ever protest that I organised, I'd just seen the movie McLibel. Has anyone seen it? A couple of people. Okay, so it was this movie that came out back when I was in high school about McDonald's and what they were doing in terms of clear felling the Amazon, hurting animals, workers' rights, etc. And I saw this film and I was so angry. I wanted to do something. I wanted to protest. And I thought, well, where should I start? Okay, down the road from my school, there's a local McDonald's. So I grabbed a few friends from school and said, hey, this is outrageous, we should go. So we walked down there and we sat in the drive-thru and blockaded the drive-thru.
There was a song, it must be 15 years ago, called Golden Arches, which was, in itself, was a huge satire on McDonald's, and it has disappeared completely.
We may have to bring
Do
it
you
back.
know the history of a song, Golden Arches?
I don't. If we'd known it, we would have sung it, but as it was...
Golden Arches across the world.
Yeah, right. So we sat in the driveway there and people threw chips at us. But cars turned away, not all cars. There were a few that almost ran over us and we had to scatter. But it was a really empowering feeling, even just seeing, 5 or 10 cars turn away. They didn't know why we were there. We didn't really have time to make signs or anything. But, I still remember that moment, and I think that protest is important for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's the immediate impact that you're having, whether it be stopping a forest being logged, stopping coal ships coming through Newcastle Harbour. But also in social movements, we think about moments and movements. And I know for many people in the Australian climate change movement or broader environmental movement, defining moments for them were actually attending protests and having their lives transformed. When they saw police brutality protect these powerful corporate interests, that moment when you feel, yes, those cars turned away or those logging trucks, you actually get a sense of your own power. And I think that even though the nature of protest has changed, and these days if I was doing that kind of a blockade, I'd definitely have video cameras there and people interviewing them so we could spread the word on social media, and we'd probably have more than just one high school there. But tactics change, those overall principles of highlighting a moment and building a movement through protests is still just as effective as ever.
So Josh, what is the personal cost these days to individuals who protest? You come directly.
It's a bit of a leading question, given I came back from court yesterday. Well, my personal experience, and it's a different M, not McDonald's, Maules Creek, and it's a different chip, not McDonald's chips, it's wood chips, was being involved in the protest against Whitehaven Coal's Maules Creek coal mine up in central New South Wales, in the Lead State Forest, where they're trying to build the largest new coal mine in Australia, currently under construction. And there's been a 5-year community-led campaign to try and stop that mine. That community has become aware and organised, and they went through the political processes, the legal processes, the financial processes to try and stop that mega coal mine being built near their properties, near their farmlands, near that arable kind of rich soil. And that ultimately didn't work. They didn't have enough power in that system, and once again, a big mining company got mining approval, they got finance, and they started to construct this mine. And it's kind of quite an incredible alliance of community groups, both environmental groups, farming groups. The traditional owners of that area, the Gomeroi people, formed a community blockade and began to run the first ever ongoing community blockade of a coal mine in Australia. And my personal experience yesterday, I took part in an action with David Pocock, which got quite a bit of publicity, and we got off without any conviction in the courts yesterday. So personally, the personal cost to me was very low. But there's been incredible personal costs borne by people in that campaign. It's the people who live out there, who have fought this for 5 years and now have a coal mine that is operating right near their properties and will live with that for another 30 years. It's the Gomeroi people who have seen sacred sites destroyed in that forest. It's the people from all across the country who moved to that camp and lived there for 6, 12 months, dedicate everything to that farm. A huge personal cost that they've borne, but also an incredible community that they've formed, an incredible strength that they've formed together, and that is something which is going to take on a life of its own this year, I think, and in the next few years. We've got a whole range of pretty big fights coming up in the fossil fuel movement. Places like Bulga, New South Wales, Rio Tinto wants to get rid of a community to expand its coal mine. Coal mines in the Galley Basin and ports in the Great Barrier Reef, which is really like the ticking time carbon bomb in Australia. Incredible sacrifice being made by individuals, but that's going to surge this movement forward as we take on these major, powerful industries. But I think we're seeing the kind of strength we need to take this on.
So Miranda, you actually had very direct personal costs with living up in a tree for 449 days. So do you want to share what it meant for you personally, but also with your own social familiar networks? Obviously they couldn't talk to you, they had to climb a tree to come up and say hello. So what were the personal costs to you?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I guess for me, and I mean not just my action of sitting in the tree for all of that time, but also for all the people in my in the forest community in Tasmania, maintaining those blockades and supporting me. There is a cost, and I guess, some of that is, around getting arrested or going to jail, as some of the people in Tasmania have. Sometimes it's the emotional trauma of seeing forests that you love, that you've spent time in, trees that you've lived in, getting destroyed, and I think that's a huge cost when you're on the front lines of these things. I guess for me it's sort of been a really interesting experience though, because I guess I've kind of made this choice to make that sacrifice and to say, well, I'm willing to, give up a year or year and a half of my life to sit there, or I'm willing to get arrested. And I think it's been an interesting experience, because for that, a lot of people have put me up on a pedestal and said, oh, that's really amazing, and really kind of made me into a hero for making that choice. And I think for me, it's quite a level of privilege to be able to make the choice if I'm going to get arrested or not get arrested, and do that sort of thing. And I think there's a lot of people in the world who that's not a choice for them. And you don't, especially for Aboriginal communities, for example, that are persecuted by the police, they don't walk out and go, am I going to get arrested as a protest today against police brutality? They just have to face it. And I think that's something that we forget about sometimes when when for me as a white person in this country, sort of making this choice to participate in these actions. And also for people around the world, like when we're talking about personal cost, I feel like it's important to acknowledge that what we experience, especially for myself as a white Australian, is quite small compared to what a lot of other people face. And I think it was just a couple of weeks ago that there was people in West Papua who were trying to just raise some money for people in Vanuatu, and Indonesian military opened fire and 3 people were shot. So there's people around the world that face persecution, imprisonment for long periods of time, torture, death, and that sort of thing. And I think it's important to see what we can give and see it in perspective on this global scale. I think a lot of people sort of, people take action because the cost of doing something is sort of, the cost of doing nothing really is outweighed by the cost of doing something. So the risk that we might take when compared to, well, what's going to happen if we do nothing? And I think for people that they don't have a buffer of privilege, the people that are in communities that are directly going to go underwater when climate change increases, those communities, for them, it's a black and white issue of that kind of cost analysis. But for us, we're kind of buffered from that with our privilege a lot from seeing those consequences. So I think it's easy to say, oh, we won't make a personal cost because it's kind of easier not to. But it doesn't mean that cost isn't going somewhere. And every time we do nothing, there are other people that are actually bearing the cost of us doing nothing. People that are facing the consequences of climate change right now. People that are facing, police brutality, imprisonment, and that sort of thing. So I think it's important to sort of step away from our privilege for a minute and have a look at what the real kind of cost benefit analysis is in these situations.
Might just jump in.
I was just going to say.
So right now in the courts, there are 77 construction workers who are facing tens of thousands of dollars of fines and jail time for attending a political protest that thousands of other workers also attended. And those 77 workers have been singled out solely because they're construction workers. So at the National Day of Action on the 4th of March today, there are about 250 construction workers who defied the Fair Work Building Commission, or the Fair Work Building Inspectorate, which is a special police force that was created originally by the Howard government and kept by the Rudd-Gillard government to police and crack down on construction workers. So every time they raise a safety concern, every time they might take a political action, so a protest or something along, or attend a rally, they are facing jail time and they're facing fines. Just them, just those construction workers, and they can be hauled before star chambers. They're denied the right to silence, they're denied the right to legal representation, they're not allowed to tell anyone that they've been questioned, and they face jail if they do tell their wife, their kids, or a union that they've been questioned. So those are the personal costs that in Australia, that a particular section of the workforce has been targeted by the Conservative powers that be, and these 77 workers right now are facing the loss of their homes, they're facing the sack, so the loss of their livelihoods, and jail time, solely for attending a protest that thousands of other working Australians attended with no threat of legal action, fines or jail time. So those are the personal costs that working people face in this country, and it's not just. Also, the other thing that we face sort of broadly as a movement is that particularly in America, but in South America, in parts of Asia and Africa, there are paramilitary-style corporate companies that are hired by big multinationals to de-unionise their workforce, and that basically involves murdering those delegates, those workers, those union officials. So, particularly in South America, Coca-Cola was one of the chief offenders, and that they had a factory there where they made Coke, and scores of union members were murdered to de-unionise those factories by Coca-Cola. So these are the personal costs that working people face when they come together, they organise, they want to take collective action. So there's a paramilitary style, really brutal regime, or you just need to look in the Middle East where the World Cup is going to be, and there's the country there, I can't remember at the moment, Qatar, but they are very, very brutal towards any attempts to unionise those workers, and there have been many, many deaths as a result. So in Australia we don't face that, but we certainly do face quite a very undemocratic erosion of our civil liberties, solely for doing the thing that everyone here has a legal and democratic right to do. I think also it's worth saying, just in terms of personal cost, is that there is a set of laws that fit the Fair Work Act that regulates what unions and union members can do. So previously, industrial action was illegal in this country, and it's now been brought into the law, but it severely restricted the kinds of things that workers can do to protest and take action. And the consequences, if you take unlawful industrial action, are also very severe. You can be fined, you can be sacked, you can face jail as well. So there's quite a great deal of personal risk if you're a working person, you decide to take some kind of protest action, particularly for the construction industry.
You got anything to add to that, Anna, before I go on to the next question?
I think Miranda's point is just absolutely spot on. That, you know, if we're not taking action, there are consequences, there are costs. We might not see them, but someone else will.
So, given what we've just talked about, why are some protests more effective than others? I'll start with you, Anna, since you waited so patiently.
That's a big question. That's a big strategic question, and I guess when I was thinking about this earlier, I think it has a lot to do with the moment. You know, you can have the same protest at a moment where an issue is really ripening, and it can get a lot of people there, a lot of attention. It can really highlight an issue in a way that brings it to the forefront of a national discussion. Or if it happens at the wrong moment, it can just fizzle and no one really was aware that it happened other than the people who were there. So partly as campaigners, we have to look really carefully, not just at our own issue and where that is. Like, I got trained in Bill Moyer's social movement theory, which has these 8 stages of social movements where you can kind of track issues as they go through a cycle of ripening and, you know, building majority public support, activist failure, and anyway, it's this model. And so you've got to look at where you think it is in that stage, but also where other issues are at, because obviously it's not like everything's contextual. So maybe we think that actually the biggest issue of a particular week is going to be climate change. But if we're looking really carefully at the news cycle or at what's actually being debated, you know, in Parliament that week, or maybe it's a totally different issue that's going to dominate public consciousness. So some really effective protests that I've seen have jumped onto a moment that we knew would be coming, like the G20, for example. We knew that was coming. We knew climate change wasn't going to be on the agenda, and there were some really effective tactics that were done, protests and other things that highlighted the Abbott government's lack of action on climate change with an existing moment. But then other times you find out only, you know, the day before maybe that there's a moment that you can jump on. And an example that comes to mind from a few years ago now was when we discovered as a climate movement that the climate skeptics had organised these rallies that were going to be Abbott. Remember when he said we should have a people's revolt on climate change?
Yeah.
And then all these climate skeptics said, "Yep, we'll be organising that people's revolt. That'll be on, you know, a couple of days from now." Outside electorate offices around the country. So the media was ramping up for this big coverage of Abbott's People's Revolt. It's all happening. Everyone's against the carbon price. And we kind of twigged onto this, and a lot of environment groups came together and said, oh, this is going to be a bad moment. It's going to really frame the whole conversation as Abbott's People's Revolt is happening. People are against the carbon price. So very quickly, groups mobilised all over the country, and particularly in Melbourne. It was within, you know, a week. And we on the day itself, the headlines that everyone was expecting was People's Revolt, people reject the climate legislation, and instead there were 250 people protesting the carbon tax and 8,000 people supporting it. And so that was a moment that we knew we had to do something about, or it would really frame the debate in an unhelpful way, and people very quickly, particularly through social media, spread the word that they had to be here at this time because there was a moment that would otherwise be very unhelpful to the movement. So yeah, for me it's partly luck, it's partly moment, and it's partly being strategic about following the cycle of where your issue's up to.
Alex?
I think it's about power, and what protests can do is they can shift the balance of power. So unsuccessful protest is one that hasn't, where the movement or the organisation organising the protest hasn't built sufficient power to have a tipping point. And whereas successful protests are ones where they've occurred at a time or a moment where there is sufficient power that the act of the protest is a tipping point and changes the power dynamic. And a successful protest is one where the people who have power have less power, or they have to give up some of their power in order to accommodate the people who are protesting. You know, workplaces are great examples of that. If you have a unorganised workplace and a couple of people protest and they, you know, take some kind of action, or they decide not to turn up, or whatever the action might be, if they don't have sufficient power in that workplace to impact the operations of the workplace, then the protest isn't going to be successful. So that's why you need to have unity and solidarity. You need to have a mass group of people in the workplace. And if you have that power, if the working people in the workplace have that power, then their action is going to shift the balance between them and their employer, and that's the main difference. And I think it's easily translatable across to other kinds of protests. The reason why blockades and the other things work when they work is because there's been an accumulation of that movement, that organisation, building power, changing the power dynamic, changing how power is exercised in the community, and then the act of the protest, which often occurs at the end of a whole bunch of failed attempts to reach accommodation, reach a negotiation, reach a compromise, and that's failed all the up to the point where the protest has taken place, the community or the group has been organised, and that shifts the power dynamic. So I think it really is, and it's not, power isn't a word that you hear often in the environment movement. The environment movement is starting to talk about power a lot more, but I think certainly unions know and talk about power a lot, and that's one of the ways that we look at how that we choose the different tactics, whether it's a protest, an action, lobbying, all of those different things about how power is exercised.
Josh, did you want to chip in there?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said, and probably add in two other elements I think are important for a powerful protest. One is who it's targeted at. So not just going through the usual steps of kind of getting angry at the government and doing a protest outside a politician's office, sometimes which is effective, but really pulling back the issue, cutting it open and seeing who has the power, who's stopping us from getting what we want, and how do we target them. I think the other element, a really simple principle for how you might think of creating a protest, is to show, not tell. So maybe if I can use Miranda's protest as an example, and correct me if this is a misinterpretation. Miranda could have spent that year and a half outside politicians' offices, drawing crowds and telling them what was wrong about chopping down trees in the Tasmanian forests, which would have been quite a passive experience for everyone involved. But by sitting in one of those grand trees for 459 days, very, very simply showed what was at stake and what this one individual was doing about that. You didn't have to put much of a caption on that picture to really understand why that action was taking place. Another example, and just to draw to it somewhere in the t-shirt, the Pacific Climate Warriors flotilla at the Newcastle Coal Port last year. Those images of particularly the Tongans in their small canoe being capsized by police boats in front of a massive coal ship. Didn't need much of a caption to explain what was unjust, what they were fighting for, and to give their protest a real resonance. So yeah, I think show not tell is an important principle.
Miranda, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess one element of it that I would like to talk about is how we measure effectiveness, because I think sometimes an action may sort of appear effective, and some other actions we may look back and go, oh, that seemed really ineffective, or that failed. And I think that's something that I've kind of learned as I've been involved over time, and sort of trying to look at the bigger picture of it. And I think especially for us that have really big goals, like in Tasmania, my goal is to end industrial scale logging of all native forests. But that's just a small goal of mine, actually, because really I have bigger goals around ending global capitalism, or ending the system of colonisation and all of these things. So when we're looking at that big picture, it's a huge thing, and to think we could go out and do a protest and fix it all, well, that's obviously, it's not just going to happen in one action or one campaign. So I think it can get hard to say, well, how can we effectively change this huge thing? And I think one way of looking at it is to break it down into small things. So if we can protect this little patch of forest here, or we can make this little difference here, and try to make little changes over time. But I think where we can kind of trip ourselves up is if we get too focused sometimes on we want some nice, neat little package of an outcome or an effective, something we can say was effective. And I think that this can sort of happen especially when we're looking at, we kind of live in an age where there's, we live under capitalism, and a lot of environment groups are operating in that corporate model, and I think we have to be careful not to sort of commodify activism where we say, oh, you know, we have environment groups out there that will be like, give us your money and we'll campaign for you and we'll make this nice neat little win, and that's a sellable kind of product that we can sort of collect money for. And I think that's something we need to be aware of, because if we try to focus on, yes, we've made this effective, then sometimes we're trying to look for what looks effective and not what is effective, and that means, you know, maybe making something look like it won here, so protecting this patch of forest, but at what cost? And I think we've sort of seen that happen in Tasmania, where some patches of forest were protected as a compromise of saying, well, now the industry can log all of these other bits, or now we're going to create a system where it's really hard for people to protest against these other things in the bigger picture. So I guess for me it's sort of looking, how can we make effective changes in the short term, but how can we make them sort of make sure that we're sort of keeping that bigger picture and making it effective in the long term. And also not to get too down about some things that we might feel are failures. And sometimes I think, you know, it seems like we haven't won, we've lost a patch of forest or a mine's gone ahead, but we have made a big impact. And I think, for example, Lake Pedder is a good example of that. It's sort of the start of the environment movement in some ways in Tasmania. And they didn't win in terms of stopping that dam from going ahead, but it created a lot of awareness about the environment and the importance of the environment, and really began the beginnings of the Franklin Dam campaign, which then went on to become a national issue and to win that. So sometimes when we think, oh, that action wasn't effective, maybe it was actually didn't achieve our goal, but it did take us more, it did bring us some steps forward to achieving other goals that we're sort of looking at as well.
This is great. Another notes.
It'll all be on YouTube, so you don't have to take notes. I do have a few other questions, but I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to go straight to the last question, and then I'll open it up to the floor. So is protest in Australia being legislated out of existence? So we might start with you, Alex.
Sure. Well, we've just had a big historic win in Australia, and the Napthine government actually introduced move-on laws, which are anti-protest laws. And it's particularly targeting two groups. One, it's targeting environment groups who like to protest out the front of different organisations, banks, logging coops, that kind of thing. But in particular, it was focused at unions. So when you have a picket, one of the key, when you have an industrial action, you go on strike. You're removing your labour, but one of the key things to make that effective is to stop scabs from coming in, or other workers who are designed to break the strike by doing the work that the ordinary workforce would have done. So you have a picket line, and the idea is that, you know, if you're a decent human being who cares about anything at all, then you would never ever cross a picket line. And so the idea of these move-on laws was to ban that, and the police were given move-on laws where they'll say you have to move on, and if you didn't, then you'd be arrested and you face jail and face massive fines. Now, when those laws were introduced, the unions had a great big rally. There were over 15,000 people that came out and protested that. As a result of that, the Labor Party actually committed to repealing those laws, and just 2 weeks ago, they did. So that is a really concrete example of where the campaigning, the organising, and the protests of working people have resulted in the restoration of rights to take public protest. So that, I think, is an example. However, I would say that what the powers that be, the Conservative powers that be, are trying to do is narrow the scope of our democratic engagement and the way that we can talk and control our communities and our economy and our society. And so there's, as I mentioned before, the great big thick Fair Work Act is all regulation. The majority of that act is actually regulating what unions can do and what working people can do to take action, whether it's industrial action or other kinds of action. And there's talk at the moment in the federal Liberal Party about banning secondary boycotts, which would then prohibit environment organisations from taking action, but it would also prohibit unions from taking any kind of action, because if you're in the supply chain, so if you're a trucking if you're the trucking union, you're in the supply chain of countless industries. So if you're taking industrial action on one thing, it means that Coles, or it means that anyone who's affected by that industrial action under the secondary boycott laws will be able to sue the union and recover punitive damages for losses. And so that then is directly, it's laws that not only stop ordinary everyday citizens from taking action and boycotting things, but it actually stops unions from taking their industrial action is a human right under the international law, the ILO. So it actually starts removing those human rights that people have because of those laws. And there's countless others. Tasmania tried to introduce those laws. There was laws in Queensland. So I think we really are seeing globally, and also in Australia, an attempt to diminish and narrow what we can do, and it's a very, very serious threat.
Anna, is social media an effective tool for protest?
I might just, on the
Oh,
the
yeah,
last
please
one,
do,
just
yeah.
briefly. I think I've just recently been really alarmed about the legislation that's about to pass probably in Western Australia, which is terrible. It reverses the onus of proof to say, say you're carrying a rope or something down the street. It reverses the onus of proof on you, so you have to prove that you're not going to use that rope to tie up an ANZ office, or
Watch out, bike riders.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's ridiculous, and the definitions in there, like you can be arrested for carrying a thing for a protest. I mean, what is a thing? My badge, my T-shirt. It's really shocking legislation. So, and that looks like it's going to pass. So I just thought we should mention that.
Please do.
On social media, yeah, it's a tactic. I mean, we have a whole range of tactics in the toolbox of campaigning. It's really, I think, what Aidan said earlier. It's good to spread the message, but if you don't actually have those powerful human bonds, then it's useless. And an example this week, we had this cookbook. We have 60 farmers in here and 50 celebrity chefs highlighting the impact of climate change on food. And we took a delegation of farmers to Parliament House, and they were amazing, so powerful in the way that they told their stories about how rising temperatures and more extreme weather are affecting their land, affecting the food that we eat. And so they had these meetings one-on-one with politicians from every party, and I was just so proud of them. They were incredibly moving and impactful. But we also know that politicians will never aim higher than what people demand, and that there's some value but only limited value in those one-on-one meetings. So they were all on social media. I mean, it's incredible how the agricultural community communicates now on Twitter and Facebook and blogs. And so they were out there spreading the message of what they were doing to other farmers using social media, and it was really important to have both of those aspects as part of that particular tactic.
Right, so because I'm mindful of time, Miranda or Josh, if you'd like to either answer the social media as an effective tool for protest, or that we're legislating it out of existence, or just some comment that you would like to make that you haven't had the opportunity to share with this wonderful audience.
Okay.
And you can bundle it all in one if
Maybe
you like.
I'll try to maybe I'll try to answer them both. I think, well, I guess for social media, I would totally agree with what Aidan said, and I think it can't replace protesting. It can't replace being out there. But I think that, while people have become reliant on social media for many aspects, I think we see that it doesn't replace protesting. When an issue sparks people's attention and they care about it, they do get out there on the streets, or they do get out there to do something about it. And I think that we'll continue to see more of that, even though people do use social media to spread the word. And I think we've seen it globally as well, some amazing protests around the world, huge mobilisations, and that opportunity for people to sort of get the message right from there to around the world has been really effective, but it hasn't replaced those protests happening. And then quickly on the legislation, I think this is a really important issue. We just faced it in Tasmania, a huge threat to protest with the anti-protest laws, and as people who might have heard Bob speak this morning said they've upped how many years people might spend in jail. You can get up to 4 years in jail for peacefully protesting in Tasmania. What we also saw was a really amazing sort of movement build up around it, and an alliance of people that in Tasmania traditionally hadn't really worked together. We had forestry workers and forest activists working side by side to try to stop this bill from going ahead, because of the way that it impacted on every single person. And so even though it's really horrible to be facing these kinds of legislation, it was really inspiring to see the fight that people put against it. And I think it's also important to remember that those in power, as I said earlier, they have a vested interest in maintaining that power, and so when they are threatened, they will fight back. And I think the more we see legislation like this, then the more we can see that actually they feel threatened. And because our movements are strong and are powerful, and the more powerful that they become, and the more we actually threaten their power, they will crack down on us. And I think this may just be the beginning, but we need to be prepared, and we need to be prepared to say, well, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're going to say, we're going to put you in jail. We still need to be out there protesting and willing, and as we said before, willing to take that cost, because if we don't, then we have a lot to lose. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, my slightly tongue-in-cheek response is like, we want to see more of the government trying to change this legislation, and we want to celebrate when they try and do that, at least a little bit, and then we need to get down and work hard to stop it going through. But it's exactly what Miranda's saying, that when they, the politicians and whoever's in their ear starts getting concerned about the power we're building, they are going to try and change. These laws are going to try and make it harder for us to mobilise, for us to assemble. So it's a sign that we're making progress, but it starts to make the challenge for all of us much more confronting. And it's something we need to, I think, start talking about in the movement. I think it's great that this is a question in this panel. We need to be talking across different civil society groups to think how, if particular union groups get targeted with legislation, how can we more broadly support them? If environment groups are getting hit hard, how do we support them? If Indigenous groups are getting hit hard, how do we support them? Because erosion in any one of these areas is going to begin to affect us all. It's going to filter out to all of us. And I think that's kind of comes to an interesting thought around social media and some of the stuff that Miranda was saying before about privilege. Like, for those of us, if you do acknowledge you have a fair bit of privilege, a fair bit of opportunity that others might not have in this city, in this country, let's make sure we get out from behind social media. We don't just express our concerns online and in written form. Let's kind of spend up a bit of that privilege. Let's put ourselves in the way of big projects, in the way of unjust laws, and protect the opportunity for others that don't have that privilege to be involved in this movement.
Sorry,
yes.
just a couple of quick points. First, on the social media, the effectiveness of it. I suppose my view is from social media creates a civil society, so it creates a virtual civil society where people who otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to certain views or felt comfortable expressing views are able to do so. So it's very important because one of the things that totalitarian forces, whether they're corporations or governments, try to do is shut down civil society. And we saw that in Egypt, we've seen that in parts of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, where what the text messages and Facebook and all the rest of it did was create a virtual civil society that people could express their dissatisfaction. Second thing, just in terms of it as a tactic, and this is perhaps not a great analogy, but social media is a gateway drug. So it's the soft drug that leads to the hard drug of protest. So it's really important to not dismiss it, because it's often the first step of engagement of a person into what is quite a hard decision to make, to take some kind of personal protest action. And so it's very important. So if you see it that way, maybe it's not the best analogy. I suppose the final thing really is about how even social media can be used. There's laws actually that govern what you can and can't say on social media, and you might not realise that. But an example is, for working when you're as a worker rather than in your other capacity. So if you talk about taking industrial action on social media and you're organising to take industrial action and it's not lawful industrial action, that is, it hasn't gone through the proper process, then you can be prosecuted and fined. And so nurses, for example, in Victoria, used Facebook to talk about taking what's called wildcat industrial action, and used social media to do that. So that's an example of where they created a virtual civil society. They organised themselves using social media, but then they put themselves at tremendous risk of prosecution by the Baillieu government. Luckily, there was a deal that was done and they got their collective agreement, and the agreement was not to prosecute them. But that's an example of the risks that even social media can play, just even talking about taking industrial action.
So I'll just go around the panel. If there's anything else you'd like to add about protest in the 21st century, and then I'm going to open up for questions. So we'll start with Josh.
I'm keen to hear from the audience.
Okay. Miranda?
Yeah, me too.
All right. So who's got any questions? Okay, Fatima.
As an Arab from Morocco, I feel very privileged, and it's great actually to hold calls like this and have an exhibition and be able to protest through our work. But since the Arab uprising, lots of people were not actually, they were marked and they were not, they were jailed or were not even actually treated as their trials. So there is like lots of sacrifices that had to be made. But in Israel, simply activists for Palestinians' rights is crushed by a tank. So that's the difference. So I feel that we are very privileged here to be able to talk about these issues, to protest and to public talks like this.
Anyone else got any other questions? Lady up the back with the crutches.
Sorry. I guess we can all accept that the effectiveness of a protest is about volume, in a sense. So I guess my question is about, is it more important to have authenticity in a protest or effectiveness? For context, I went to a power shift conference once where the campaigner was advocating strategies like, instead of, say, 50 people protesting the treatment of refugees in Grima Place, having 10 people in a room making hundreds of calls every hour, on the hour, under the names of different constituents, or having 5 people in a room writing hundreds of letters under different names. I guess this is a means to an end question. How do you weigh up the human cost of refugees in the refugee camps versus, I suppose, the undermining of representative democracy, if it's effective?
Anna, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, interesting. I don't know that I've ever heard people suggest that we should make calls under different names or write letters under fake names. That's interesting. Yeah. So I guess your question about how do we best work within the system that we have. What we have right now, it's not a democracy. I mean, it's just not. Our politicians are so influenced by corporate power that the way that you would expect a democracy to work is certainly far from it in Australia. So with that system, I think there's room for experimentation and unique tactics. I disagree that the number of people at the protest or volume is the core determinant of effectiveness. So if you think about things like the freedom rides, both in Australia and the United States, where you had people really risking a lot and highlighting the injustice in an incredibly powerful way, that was about the action that they were taking rather than the number of people that they had. The action that the civil rights movement had with Rosa Parks standing up on a bus. Obviously it wasn't just her, it was a whole movement that had planned that strategy, but it culminated in her taking that action as one person. So I think that there are a lot of strategic questions to weigh up when you're thinking about the best ways to influence a policy. And one other thing, I mentioned Bill Moyer before with the 8 stages of social movements. He also has a model about the 4 roles in a social movement. So it's citizen, rebel, reformer, and change agent. And he says we need all 4 roles in a social movement, but there are effective and ineffective ways of playing each role. So it's about thinking for yourself when you're trying to make the decision of where can you be most effective, what role you're best to play, and then whatever role that is, and that'll change over the course of your life and the context, making sure you play that in the most effective way possible. So I definitely recommend checking out Bill Moyer's work. It's from a long time ago, but I think his work is still really relevant for social movements today.
Did you want to have it?
I've actually got a duck.
No, I know.
Sorry,
No,
I'm
please
just going to
go.
another Earth Hour event, but it's lovely to have been
Thank
with
you so
Thank
much,
you
and I've got a
much.
present I'll give to you later. And everybody buy Anna's book.
Although we have to go, so you won't be able to.
Oh no, which they can get online.
Yeah, if you just go to earthhour.org.au, they're $40, and they're beautiful stories from farmers along with recipes.
Thank you, Anna. Bye-bye. Alex.
Well, I would really not recommend making phone calls under a name that's not your own or writing a letter that's under a name that's not your own. I think having a mass movement is important. That's definitely important. But I'll give you just a quick example. The Clean Start campaign is cleaners in CBDs, saying we want dignity, we want respect as cleaners. The cleaning contractors had, for over many years, reduced their rights and reduced their conditions. And what they said, they would come to the union, I worked for the union at that stage, and they'd say, oh, cleaners are happy. They're happy that they only get 2 hours a night and they need to clean the same amount space that they used to when they got 4 hours, and they had no rights when contracts changed. But the cleaners are happy with that. And so what the union did was talk to the clean, go out to our members and say, you know, are you happy with this? No. But we're only able to get a few brave cleaners who are willing to stand up and say that and go to the contractors. And so we held very successful protests out the front of these cleaning offices and out front of the offices where they had the contracts, where it was just a handful of cleaners, just 2 or 3 cleaners with megaphones, with drums, with giant toilet brushes, and you know, all the different things to show that cleaners in the CBD wanted respect and they wanted to be treated with dignity. So you don't need a large, it's not just about volume. It is when you say, it is, I think, about power and tipping that power. So if you make the decision, the strategic decision, as Anna was saying, that you need a mass protest and that's what's going to shift the decision makers and it's what's going to change the power dynamic, then that's when you try to fill the MCG and you say we're going to get everyone out. But often it depends on the target, which is what Josh has been talking about. And if the target is the office workers in an office who don't know anything about the cleaning contract, but they're the ones that decide who has the contract, and you get a couple of cleaners standing out the front saying we get treated like shit, then that is enough to change the power dynamic. So it really is, you need to have an understanding of who and what and why and how power works. So I don't think it is just about volume.
Okay, any more questions before we break up? Because everyone's been here for nearly 2
I've
hours.
just got one.
Okay.
It seems that the effective forms of activism, and I'm thinking of environmental activism, involve people putting their bodies on the line. Just wondering what the panel thinks about the need for civil disobedience. Its effectiveness. It seems that it's effective in the environmental area.
I think it's a terrible idea. No, no, that's because I was getting in front of the court for that yesterday. I think there's one thing you've kind of talked about quite recently in the movement in blockades I've been involved with is like arrestables kind of glorification. So often the people that are in a protest willing to get arrested might get quite glorified in how we talk within the movement because they're the ones that might become the media story and all that. But behind the scenes of any of that kind of action, there'll be 3-4 times the number of people in support roles to make that pull off. And I'm sure with Miranda's action, there would have been a horde of people that were supporting you to be up there for that time. Any position where there's someone kind of undertaking civil disobedience, there'll be people in the background supporting. And if that action, that moment of civil disobedience is within a strategy, is part of achieving maybe a short-term goal on the way to achieving bigger long-term big change goals, then absolutely I think it plays a role. As Bob said, we shouldn't just kind of go get ourselves arrested for the heck of it. I think it's an internal process of becoming ready to take that kind of action, and it's a group process of working out what's strategic. But certainly, when people do that well, it's incredibly powerful as a media story and as an expression of how strongly we're willing to take action to confront injustice.
Miranda, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important, and not just because it's effective. I think it's really effective. I also think it's important in and of itself because as a form of protest, it actually can undermine some of the structures that we're trying to challenge. So instead of sort of going and saying to corporations, can you please make this change, that's sort of kind of giving them the power as though they should have the power to decide whether our forest should get cut down or not. By going out there and saying, oh, well, the government decided these forests should get cut down, the corporations decided the forest should get cut down, but the people don't want them, we're just going to go and stop it. That's a really powerful act to take, and I think it takes the power back into our own hands in a really amazing way. And I think that's kind of a really important aspect of it because it's not just about, well, how do we achieve, this goal of getting the forest protected, but how do we sort of achieve our broader goals in terms of, building our community and putting the power back in our own hands, which is where it should be.
Alex?
Well, when there is an unjust law, it's our duty to oppose it. And I think that is certainly, I wouldn't say that anyone in the union movement seeks to get arrested, but when there is a absolute point of principle, and there is an unjust law, and there is no other option. I mean, there's union leaders have gone to jail, or faced jail. There's, ARC Tribe was an ordinary construction worker, faced massive fines and jail time simply because he refused to answer questions that he had no lawful right to refuse to answer questions. But and that's a form of civil disobedience. And when there's an unjust law, it is our duty to resist it.
Thank you very much. I think it's been a wonderful discussion, and thank you so much for your